try to think about how much your sense of self, of who you are, comes from where you're born, where your home is. Emma Goldman grew up in a borderland. She was born in 1869 in Kovno, in the Russian Empire, which is now actually Kaunas, Lithuania. But one interesting thing about Kovno was that it sat right smack on top of the border of the German-speaking Prussian kingdom. So Goldman grew up speaking both German and Russian. And as an interesting historical aside, that border hadn't really been there for a particularly long time. Until a few decades before, both sides of the border had been part of Poland. On top of that, she was a Jewish person in the Tsar's Russia, which was its own form of marginality. And also meant that on top of German and Russian, she also spoke Yiddish. I don't want to be too simplistic or reductive about this next point, but over the course of this whole podcast, I want to start thinking about Emma Goldman, trying to understand her. How did she get to have the beliefs that she had? She grew up famously to believe that there should be no such thing as countries, that nobody should be a citizen of anywhere, that we'd all be better off if we were just citizens of the world. I have to wonder, did growing up in a place like that help form her opinion that the whole idea of countries is just silly? Did it help her believe that countries aren't really necessary, and if anything, they're actively harmful? And like I said, I don't want to be too simplistic about this, because of course there are tons of people who grew up in border countries who didn't grow up to be anarchists. But I do think it's something interesting to think about. And over the course of the next bunch of episodes, as we try to understand her, I think maybe it's worth keeping in the back of our minds. I'm Jeff Grossman, and this is Across from Jericho, an activist history podcast. This season, we're talking about the famous, or infamous, anarchists Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. In this episode, Goldman comes to America and in a Rochester beer hall discovers anarchism for the first time. Regardless of what you think about this concept of marginality, there's not much doubt that Goldman had a rough childhood. She talks about her father being physically abusive, beating her with a strap, and one time when she came home with a bad report card, punching her in the back of the head as she was looking out the window. She had two older sisters, Lena and Helena, and most of the time they got along great. Except for one day they were fighting over a game of marbles, and Lena kicked her and told her that actually her father wasn't their father. Their father had died young, and their mother had gotten remarried to Emma's father, which clearly led to some sort of underlying resentment. Another time, her father tried to do something good, but it went badly amiss. He sent her to live with his own mother and his three sisters in the bigger city of Königsberg. The idea was she would go to a private school there, a better school than they had locally, which sounds great. And by the way, I should mention that Goldman casually says that her grandmother was a smuggler, but she doesn't say what she smuggled, so I've always been curious about that. But her father sent 40 rubles a month to pay for this private school. And that all was working out great until her grandmother had to go away for an extended period of time. Whether or not that was connected to the smuggling, I have no idea, but in any event, she left. And as soon as she left, Goldman's uncle pulled her out of the school and started pocketing the 40 rubles for himself. Not only that, he put her to work around the house like Cinderella. Her three aunts were too intimidated by him to actually say anything to anybody, and the only people that were nice to her were two older ladies who happened to live downstairs. One day Goldman talked back to her uncle, and he got so mad that he kicked her down the stairs, spraining her ankle. This was a bad enough injury that one of her aunts actually got some courage and wrote to her father, who came and picked her up. And that's when he discovered that the uncle had been stealing the 40 rubles all along. Goldman's grandmother came back too and threw the uncle out of the house. And to get back to the topic of borderlands just for a quick sec, because I think it's interesting, Königsberg is now the Russian city of Kaliningrad, which is a little pocket of Russia detached from the rest of the country and surrounded by Lithuania and Poland, sort of like a Russian version of Alaska. There's one more story I feel like I need to tell here, and I hesitate to do it because I don't want you to think that this podcast is all going to be darkness, and I promise you it won't be. But I really don't think I could leave this story out. Goldman herself says it was formative, and I think that we need to keep it in mind when we think about her future relationships. By the time she was a teenager, her family had moved to St. Petersburg, where her dad ran a grocery store, which wasn't too particularly successful. When Goldman was 15, she started dating a 20-year-old who worked in a hotel that she used to walk by all the time. And this went by for quite a little while, and when it started out, she actually describes it as being pretty sweet. like going out for pastries and things like that. The first problem was once they were walking the park and her dad saw them from a distance. When she got home, he beat her again. Not surprisingly, this didn't help her relationship with her dad at all, and it also didn't stop her from dating the boy. Not too long after that, he asked her if she wanted a private tour of the hotel, which she foolishly said yes to, and I think you could probably guess where this is going to go. He gave her a glass of some sort of liquor and ripped her dress open. She doesn't use the word rape explicitly, but I don't think she needed to. She talks about how she fought back, how painful it was, and how full of shame she was afterwards. She talks about how scarred she was by this experience, how it never left her, and how it interfered with her relationships with men forever after. By this point, Lena had moved to America and was living with her husband in upstate New York, in Rochester to be exact. You could understand why Emma begged her dad to let her go to America too. This is how she describes it in her memoirs, Living My Life, as read by Sarah Natochenny.
How I had fought with my father to get him to let me go to America with Helena. In the end, I had won, and late in December 1885, Helena and I had left St. Petersburg for Hamburg, there embarking on the steamer Elbe for the Promised Land.
And here's how she describes the view of New York Harbor.
The last day of our journey comes vividly to my mind. Everybody was on deck. Helena and I stood pressed to each other, enraptured by the sight of the harbor and the Statue of Liberty suddenly emerging from the mist. Ah, there she was, the symbol of hope, of freedom, of opportunity. She held her torch high to light the way to the free country, the asylum of the oppressed of all lands. We, too, Helena and I, would find a place in the generous heart of America. Our spirits were high, our eyes filled with tears.
That's beautiful, right? I love that turn of phrase about the generous heart of America. The only problem with it is it didn't actually happen. I mean, the bones of the story are true. Lena and her husband were living in Rochester, and Emma and Helena did come over from Russia in December of 1885. The ship they were on wasn't the Elbe, it was the Gellert, which I know because I found the immigration records myself, and also later I found it compiled by the hugely authoritative Emma Goldman Papers Project, which I'll talk more about in a later episode. For some reason, even though she was 16, both Emma and Helena listed their ages on the passenger manifest as 24. The name of the ship is probably trivia, and could easily have been misremembered. But the one thing I don't think was a question of poor memory, but was just a made-up story, is the whole bit about the Statue of Liberty. I know that didn't happen because the Statue of Liberty hadn't been built yet. I do think it makes for a better story, and if I had been just reading her memoirs for fun, I really wouldn't care about it at all. The problem I have is, with this whole podcast series, I'm trying to be the best journalist I can be. And basically all the stories I've told you so far about her family, about her father, about going to live with her uncle, about the attack in the hotel, all those stories came from the same memoir. I basically just paraphrased them, and those things aren't fact-checkable. So if I know for a fact that the whole thing about the Statue of Liberty was made up, why do I believe the rest of the stuff? And her memoirs are great. To be honest with you, they form the backbone of this whole podcast, but how could I rely on them in good faith? How do I know what's true? How do I know what's not? Well, for one thing, I did as much fact-checking as I possibly could. The Statue of Liberty thing seems to be a rare exception. Almost everything I was able to fact-check turned out to be true. Even stuff when I read it, I thought, no way, this actually never happened. Almost always it turned out that it had. But not only that, it seemed to me that Living My Life had to have other value as a memoir, even if there are some slight discrepancies between it and real life. And I was trying to think about it, and I was trying to articulate this, and I figured I'd ask one of the few people who've been thinking about this exact question in a lot more depth than I have. I talked to Nolan Bennett, who's a professor of democracy and justice studies at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, and he's made a specialty of studying autobiographies, and Living My Life in particular. He's written about it and taught it, so I asked him this question. How should we think about it? Is it a reliable primary source document? Is it valuable for something else? Is it both? This is how he thinks about it.
That's a good problem to think about. And that's something you have to confront, whether you're a journalist, whether you're a student, a professor, someone on the street, when you're reading anyone according to their own words, right? How do I filter out fact from fiction? How do I filter out embellishment from, evidence I'd find elsewhere? With Goldman, it's even harder because Living My Life is 1,000 pages. I mean, it's an omnibus. It is simply staggering. One of the things I had to contend with when first working on it is, well, how am I going to convince anybody to actually read this book that is 1,000 pages? I think something to keep in mind here is that 1,000 pages for Goldman was insurrectionary in itself. This is someone who, like radicals at the time, but not only then, this is true today too, constantly had her experiences, her speech, her testimony denied by state actors, by the police, by other citizens, or even people within her own circles. And so I think going into this, we need to be empathetic, and we need to understand that already for Goldman to write this in the 1930s was really an act of courage and speaking truth to power in a much broader sense. So I encourage people, if anything, not to let your guard down, like you said, in being a good historian, being a good journalist, being skeptical, but to go in generously and to recognize that this is someone who had to pull from letters and memories the facts of her life while actively having her documents taken from her by state actors around her, right? So this is different, I think. Like I said, this is a question we have to wrestle with any memoir or autobiography, but it's so different than reading George W. Bush's Decision Points. It's so different than reading even the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. So those are some of the things I kind of think about. The final thing I'll say here is we can understand there are different Goldmans. Emma Goldman herself spoke often about there being almost multiplicities of her, different versions of her, that of a portrait, that seen in the press, that coming through her propaganda. And I think it's totally fine for us to talk about the Goldman of Living My Life as she saw herself in the autobiography, and the Goldman that we uncover through the archives, through the experiences of her comrades or her detractors. And we sit with all those.
That idea of there being multiple Goldmans is so important to understand, and it's one of the things that interests me most about her. She would have called herself a propagandist back in the day before propaganda had such a negative connotation. I think in today's language, we would think of her as an influencer. Not only did she run her own newspaper, but she was so famous, or so infamous, depending on how you look at it, that when she would give a speech, thousands of people would show up. She was super conscious of her own image. So much of what she did and said was specifically designed to play to an audience. Living My Life was first published in 1931 when she was about 62 years old. This is the story that she wanted people to remember about her. This is her own myth-making about herself. I think that's important to know too. So, in the end, I did decide to keep relying on it as one of the primary sources for this podcast. I promise I'll be transparent and let you know when I think things might be a little bit sketchy. Also, there are notes on the website that show you where I found all of the direct quotes that I use, and wherever possible, I'm going to include links, so if you want to, you can look it up for yourself. And don't hesitate to get in touch with me. My email will be on the website, or even better, reach out through social so other people can see your question too. I don't want this podcast to be a one-sided conversation, or to say it's completely authoritative. I mean for it to be the opening of a conversation. I want to hear your voices. If you have any questions about where I found something, for sure, let me know. Let's talk about it. In any event, it's clear that Emma and Helena got to Rochester right around New Year's Day at the beginning of 1886. Goldman found a job sewing dresses in a factory, and not long after that, her family in Rochester grew. For one thing, Lena had a baby girl named Stella, which was important because Stella would grow up to be one of Emma's closest confidants. At about the same time, Emma's dad had to shut his store in St. Petersburg. As she explains it, he had to pay so many bribes to so many different officials that it wasn't worth keeping the store open. So her parents and her two little brothers came to Rochester too, where her dad opened a new store and lived on top of it. One of her coworkers at the factory was a guy named Jacob Kershner, who also had recently come from Russia, so they started making conversation, and then not long after that started dating. Even though they're going out, Goldman is pretty bored and lonely and restless in the evenings, and she and Helena start going to meetings of a socialist club that meets at a German beer hall. One night Goldman went by herself, and there was a speaker there named Johanna Greie. That night is really Goldman's origin story, her equivalent of a radioactive spider bite. The night that Emma Goldman became Emma Goldman. Greie talked about 8 men, all anarchists, who had just been convicted in Chicago of a bombing that they clearly didn't do. That bombing is part of what's been called the Haymarket Riot, which was a turning point not only for Goldman, but really for the whole history of the American labor movement. To really understand what happened and its importance, I reached out to a couple people. One of them was Randall, a history professor at Birmingham Southern College and the author of the book Terrorism, A History. He told me that even calling the Haymarket Riot a riot is by itself a political act. I asked him if he could help me understand it, and this is the first thing he said.
So the Haymarket, it's also interesting that we call it a riot, just like we call in American history these things race riots, which were actually, white supremacist massacres of Black people. So the use of the term Haymarket Riot was a masterful job of framing.
We're going to hear more about Professor Law's perspective in just a couple of minutes. In the meanwhile, though, I also talked to Jacqueline Jones. She's a history professor at the University of Texas at Austin and president of the American Historical Association. She's the author of Goddess of Anarchy, The Life and Times of Lucy Parsons. Lucy Parsons was an anarchist married to Albert Parsons, one of the Haymarket defendants. Here's how Professor Jones describes what happened at Haymarket.
On May 1st, 1886, Chicago workers went out on strike en masse to agitate for an 8-hour workday. This was a period when workers could work up to 12, 14 hours a day. It was before the New Deal, before maximum hours, minimum wages legislation. And the turnout was really spectacular. There was a strike at a farm machinery company, the McCormick Company, on May 3rd. And in the course of resisting the scabs who had come in to take the place of the strikers, a worker was killed. In response to that killing by the police, the anarchists of Chicago called for a rally the next day, May 4th, in Haymarket Square. And that rally took place that evening of May 4th. And once the speakers were pretty much finished, actually, clouds were rolling in. It looked like it was going to rain. Someone threw a bomb into the square. This was right after about 80 police officers had entered the square as a very provocative measure. But in any case, the bomb immediately killed one police officer, and eventually 6 more succumbed to their wounds. At least 4 workers who were attending the rally were killed. An unknown number actually were killed, I think, in the end. But the trial of the defendants who were charged with conspiracy to murder, the trial, which was held the following year, it was held that year, the summer of 1886, from June to August. There were 8 defendants, and it was a farce of a trial. First of all, no one knows now who threw the bomb. And it was pretty clear that the 8 defendants did not throw the bomb. They were either not in the square at the time, or people could see them. They were not hiding in an alleyway and lobbing a bomb into the police presence. The judge in the trial, the Haymarket trial, was clearly biased. The jury included no peers of the men. There were no union members. And in the end, it was a farce of a trial. There are reports that members of the jury played cards while the testimony was ongoing. In any case, all 8 defendants, again, clearly not the bomb thrower, were declared guilty. And Two received one received a long sentence, two received commuted sentences of life imprisonment from the governor of Illinois eventually. One committed suicide in jail, and 4 were executed.
Just to be clear, it wasn't the sort of thing where maybe there was something questionable about the trial, or that it became obvious later that there was something wrong with it. There was something obviously wrong with it at the time.
Yes, it was clear. I mean, the judge made clear his feelings against the defendants early on. The jurors were chosen in the end randomly, and even some of them, before they were chosen, said they believed the defendants to be guilty, which we would today consider outrageous. But the judge asked them if they could change their mind if the evidence suggested otherwise, and they agreed they could change their mind. But in any case, it was clear the jury was biased as well. So the trial was an outrage, really. And I think it was the idea that the authorities had no idea actually who threw the bomb. They were essentially rounding up well-known anarchists who were editing papers. The Germans were editing their own paper, Arbeiterzeitung. Albert Parsons had his paper, The Alarm, and the authorities really feared these anarchist publications. I should say at this point that a very, very tiny number of Chicago workers were anarchists at this point, but they made a lot of noise. And as I said, they engaged in very heated rhetoric meant to frighten the authorities. So when it came to round up what we might call the usual suspects, it really wasn't surprising that they got caught up in this dragnet after the bombing.
So there's Goldman sitting in this beer hall listening to Johanna Greia talk about how these 8 men in Chicago have been railroaded. And not only were they wrongly convicted, most of them were sentenced to hang. And Goldman is outraged. I mean, I can't really express the depth of her moral indignation about this. She started from then on studying everything she could get her hands on about anarchism to figure out who these men were. And I don't mean to jump to the epilogue already, but just to show you the depth of her lifelong connection to these people, her grave is right next to the Haymarket Monument. There she is at 16 years old, or maybe just 17, wondering for the first time in her life, what is anarchism? And actually, I think that's a good place in this podcast to ask that same question ourselves, because we're going to talk a lot about it. It's important for us to understand just what it is we're talking about. What is anarchism? What is this idea that she first started thinking about then in Rochester that took over her life? What does it mean? Let's start by saying what it's not. For one thing, it's not Marxism. In a lot of ways, it's the exact opposite of Marxism. Here's how Professor Law describes it.
So Marx and the founders of anarchism, late first half of the 19th century, agreed in the sense that the well-to-do, the haves oppressed the have-nots. They agreed. Bakunin would be probably the great figure in terms of mid 19th century anarchism, believed that a revolution was going to come, that it was essentially inevitable, that it would emancipate the people. They, of course, had very different mechanisms. They imagined very different mechanisms. Marx imagined a dictatorship of the proletariat and essentially another working class proletarian body that would manage society through to the communist utopia. Anarchists from the beginning believe in local government, communes, obviously mistrust of, hatred of government, believing that any sort of organization that involves the state and state power becomes an agent of oppression. So even though they were active on behalf of the same people and imagined a far, far down the road, a classless utopia, the Marxists and the anarchists had very different ways of getting there.
In other words, while the Marxists believe in a strong central government, the anarchists believe in no government. But to say they believe in no government is not to say they believe in chaos. That's a misunderstanding of what anarchism is all about. Elena Lucidou teaches criminal law and criminal justice at Birkbeck Law School, which is part of the University of London. She specializes in political theory, particularly as it relates to anarchism, gender, and sexuality. She first got interested in studying anarchism after a friend recommended that she read Living My Life, and then she started thinking about it as an alternate way that we could organize our lives. And honestly, who better to learn about anarchism from than a law professor? She agrees that thinking about anarchists as believing in chaos is a total misunderstanding. In fact, she says, portraying them that way might be a deliberate smear designed to limit their voices. Let's listen.
This idea that anarchists are lawless and they don't want law comes, it's a rhetoric, it's a political rhetoric to curb protest, which is a very important civil right in any democratic society. And I think that's if anarchism, whether you're an anarchist or an anarchist or a liberal, I think one of the things that brings them together is this idea that we need to protest unjust laws. We need to kind of make sure that our freedom to protest, our freedom to movement is present in society. It doesn't disappear. So the reason that I think sometimes the media, but also definitely political figures want to call anarchists as lawless comes from a desire to control a population that wants to protest unjust laws.
Okay, then anarchism isn't Marxism, and it isn't lawlessness, but that doesn't answer the question. What is it? What do anarchists actually believe in? Here's what Lucidou says.
Well, in terms of, they're very, the etymology, as you'll find in any sort of book that you open on anarchism, comes from the Greek anarchia, and it means a society without rulers or leaders, right? And the variation of how that is imagined, it depends on what strand of anarchism one belongs to. And there are a variety from left libertarians to anarcho-communists, all right? But and if we can talk a little bit about left libertarians, because I think Emma Goldman was influenced by one of the U.S. kind of left libertarians, Henry David Thoreau, for example. She was very much influenced by his ideas of not wanting to, and she quotes him in her trial, I think. She was interested by kind of this idea of individuals can autonomously must manage themselves and their everyday lives, and not wanting any governmental intervention. So the core of I guess the libertarian aspect of anarchism is freedom of thinking, freedom to act in any way that one wants. But that doesn't mean, that this freedom to act in any way that one wants is doesn't take into consideration society, all right? And when Thoreau was served with poll tax, right, the tax that individuals get paid had to pay around that period, a very the method in which governments got revenue, irrespective of their salaries. When he was served with that, he thought, no, I'm not going to pay. I'm not going to pay it. And the reason he didn't want to pay this, I'm sure you know, is because he thought that the US was in war with Mexico, and that war was imperialist, and as long as other peoples will be enslaved by other governments, he would not pay a tax to his government, because his freedom was not more important than Mexican people. So I thought that shows us that despite of the individualist sort of aspect of libertarian anarchism, there is a moral compass that focuses on social responsibility. So I think that's kind of quite interesting. more anarcho-communist sort of form of anarchism is interested in organizing society around associations. So Kropotkin is one of the people that were propagating sort of anarcho-communism around associations where people join freely and make decisions collectively, horizontally. There's no private property. One of the most important things I think of anarcho-communism is the abolition of private property, where everybody gets remunerated according to their needs, and where mutual aid is part of the ethos of organizing that society. These, I think, are the main principle. But if we look at both of these polar opposite, I would say, ideas of anarchism, they have some important suggestions as meeting points. And their meeting point is the abolition of state, the abolition of private property, non-government intervention in the affairs of people, and free education, free medical care. All this kind of common good should be provided free, and horizontal decision making. Now, more contemporary anarchists, like thinkers more than activists, like Saul Newman and Ruth Keenan, believe that anarchism cannot get rid of the state nowadays. All right, we cannot get rid of the state. So the best way of organizing our lives is to use anarchist ideas to democratize our institutions and our lives. So more horizontal decision making in universities, in local communities, will be one way of going forward with, and using the anarchist ideas as much as possible to reorganize.
So, if I'm understanding correctly, it's not that classical anarchists are without morals or without guiding principles. It's that they're without governmental legal codes?
Yeah. But I mean, their belief is that kind of statutes or codes are too restrictive, because I mean, Kropotkin has this very funny example in one of his essays where he says, well, there's a village and there has been a storm and trees fell down and they cut the main roads to the village, and they're waiting for the health and safety people to come and remove those trees that stopped any vehicles or any carriages going to the village to get supplies, while people could do it themselves. So why do we have such laws? Why don't we question these laws? Such laws make it pretty impossible for people to function sometimes in society. So I think kind of anarchists are against institutional law, but they have their own, if you want, ethos or moral compass, whatever you want to call it, that they think can solve any conflicts that may arise in society, because they believe that there will be a conflictless society, but they believe that through deliberation, through horizontal decision making, these conflicts could be resolved.
A society in the classical anarchist tradition of freedom of choice, of autonomy, of everybody making their own decisions for themselves, sounds wonderful. I also love the idea of mutual aid societies, of people pitching in and helping each other out. And today there are mutual aid societies thriving all over the world. But to me, there is one glaring, immediate, obvious question that this doesn't address. All good intentions aside, why doesn't this turn into the purge? However you might feel that police tend to abuse their power, they are sort of essential in stopping crime. So in a society without government and without police, what do you do? The classical anarchist answer would be that truly antisocial behavior is really rare. Almost all crime stems from economic need. So if you get rid of private property, if you get rid of money, then a lot of the incentive for crime will disappear in the first place.
what we see with all this, I guess, is a specific understanding that the reasons that perhaps we have injustices in society or criminality doesn't come because individuals are by nature crimogenic, all right? Individuals are not by nature crimogenic, but rather, all right, and Emma Goldman writes extensively about that, and so does Alexander Bergman, is because the conditions in society are unequal economically and socially. And the law, and in particular, and its institutions such as the police, serve only, in, if we use the kind of more contemporary language, the 1% of society. And that 1%, and unless we abolish that 1%, which holds most of privilege in our society, we will not have an equal society, and we will not have, we will continue to have crime. Right, but they don't necessarily want to say that poor people are criminals, but they want to kind of put the emphasis on those that create the conditions for criminality to happen. And I think in the US, the defund the police movement that comes from race justice kind of movements such as Black Lives Matter, I think, is moving towards that direction. It's kind of trying to say that we need to have less money being put in institutions like the police, because look what happens. It creates more criminals, or it kills people, such as George Floyd, for example, and more money into mental health programs, housing, education, food banks, stuff like that.
If you get rid of government, that doesn't just mean you get rid of police. It also means you get rid of prisons and the entire criminal justice system. But, Dr. Lucy Ju says, it doesn't mean there aren't ways to confront difficult or problematic behaviors that still remain.
If you're asking me how would anarchists perhaps decide what to do with somebody that might have committed a crime, all right? So as I explained earlier, their explanation is there will be no crimes in an anarchist society because we will solve all the economic and social inequalities that exist because of the way that we will reorganize society. So there will be different organizational principles there that will reduce, if not disappear, criminality disappear. Well, I think semi-autonomous or autonomous anarchist societies that exist, such as Christiania in Denmark, for example, had to address the issue of drug users that they found kind of being a nuance in their community by having trials, but those trials were over a different form. I think they were not trials based on core statutes, but they came out of conversations between members of the community, members of Christiania, and the ways in which they thought that those people that joined the community breached their rules, so they had to either conform to the rules or be exiled. One of my friends did a film about Christiania where an artist friend did, Nicolene Verhaskem has done a film about Christiania where she says that one of the most interesting thing that comes out of the interviews is that they thought that the only way you can have an anarchist society is to be honest, and I thought that's quite interesting. So they're not lawless. They have quite a lot of moral values that they carry along, like respect to each other, honesty, trust, etc., that they believe that they're principles that we could use to reorganize society and without law.
Okay, in all honesty, I love this idea. I'm not sure my rational brain is sold on it yet or convinced that it would actually happen like that, but I really want to be convinced. I hope it's true. It's so optimistic, and despite everything, has such deep faith in the abiding goodness of humanity that, like, why can't this be true? I'm trying hard to be a believer, but one thing that gets in the way that any discussion of anarchism has to grapple with is the history of anarchist violence. There's been a whole history of anarchist bombings and assassinations especially. How do you square this history of violence with anarchism's fundamental optimism? That paradox is really driving this entire podcast. You might remember that I had said I'd ask Professor Law about Haymarket. I didn't give you his answer yet. And the reason I held it off until now is because he gets further into this question of violence. He agrees that the men who were convicted didn't do the bombing, that the trial was a scam, but he also talks about this question of violence and says it's not quite as easy as that. Here's how he describes what happened at Haymarket and afterwards.
And late in the meeting, as most of the people had wandered away, held in the Haymarket of Chicago, somebody throws a bomb that kills one police officer, mortally injures a few more of them, and then shooting starts, most of which was probably carried out by the authorities, by the police, that kills more police and kills demonstrators. Well, this then leads to a massive crackdown by the authorities, who don't know who threw the bomb, but they arrest everybody they know. They arrest and their names are well known, August Spies and others. They arrest anarchists, they arrest socialists, they arrest trade union activists. They use this as the opportunity to go on this campaign against the left. And it becomes echoed. First Chicago, other major cities across the United States. This is really the first Red Scare, the fear that the Reds, the left, is going to, anarchist, socialist, communist, doesn't matter, all left of center, are going to use violence to overthrow the existing order, to destroy Western civilization, to destroy America, to destroy capitalism, so on and so forth. The trial of the anarchists arrested has a hard time showing who did it. In fact, they never conclusively determined who did it. And at one point, the judge in the trial pretty explicitly says, you're not on trial because you threw the bomb. You're on trial because you're an anarchist. And we believe you inspired whoever threw the bomb. And 5 are sentenced to death. 1 commits suicide beforehand. So several are executed. A few more are put in prison. So immediately the backlash sets in that this was judicial, this was miscarriage of justice, almost a sort of judicial execution of those who weren't involved. But actually, in recent years, some revision work has been done that goes back to the actual trial record and really shows quite conclusively that the people who had been arrested at the Haymarket had been building bombs, had been plotting violence, that while they might not themselves have actually thrown the bomb, they probably knew who did. They were probably involved with them. And it really probably was a part of a larger plot. So it becomes institutionalized in the memory of the left, of the state using its means, the police and the courts, to go after those on the left. It's actually probably true is that the people who were arrested and executed really were involved in violence and plotting violence, just not on that particular day. In the sense, like later McCarthy was wrong about who he was accusing, except he was right that the State Department a decade earlier had been full of communists. So it becomes this important moment for those on the left, but it also becomes important because it spreads the notion. It helps entrench the notion, which had already existed for a while, going back to like the Molly Maguires in the 1860s, that the American labor movement was violent, was full of radicals, full of these wild-haired, wild-eyed immigrants with unpronounceable last names, who were dead set on the destruction of America. And so actually the labor movements of the left try to distance themselves. They try to keep themselves away from Haymarket and anarchism because it completely taints what they're doing. It shuts down the possibility of any sort of negotiated settlement with the authorities, and it turns off any possibility of a sympathetic middle class that's fed these stories from the mainstream press. So it becomes very counterproductive. Later, though, the important factor becomes, why do the anarchists keep using this kind of violence when it turns so many people off? Probably it's because it turns so many people off, because later, when American trade unions and American socialist parties start to gain traction, anarchists fear that these movements of the left will gain negotiated settlements with the authorities, not carry out a revolution, which is the only thing that'll fix the lives of the lower classes, but will in fact get rid of the opportunity, will destroy the chance of revolution by satisfying the working classes with crumbs from the capitalist table. So anarchists increasingly turn to violence in the face of trade union and socialist successes to try to again jump the working class back onto the revolutionary track. That's another important story, and how anarchists, who always represent a small segment of the radical fringe, get most of the bandwidth in terms of the press and state attention. And they're successful in that sense, but they're also successful in the fact that they set back the American labor movement from having from being much of a partner with the state or the mainstream.
So looked at that way, not only is anarchist violence self-defeating in the sense that it turns the public off from anything good that they're trying to do, but in a way, that's almost the point. They're trying to sabotage less extreme progressives from being able to cut deals and successfully sell out the cause. Okay, but I didn't want to leave it at that. I wanted to talk to Dr. Luzidu and get her perspective on it. But when comparing these answers, it's a little bit apples and oranges. Just keep in mind that I had asked Professor Law specifically about Haymarket, and we were talking about that era. Dr. Luzidu has a more contemporary perspective and says that anarchism has by now outgrown this kind of personal violence. In her mind, she doesn't deny the history of anarchist violence, but she says it's largely a thing of the past. Let's hear it from her.
Even Emma Goldman, I think, in her essay on violence, says that these are very rare examples, and they only happen at times when people feel that the conditions of life are so intolerable, and they are a form of self-defense. All right, she sees them as when you see such acts of violence, she sees them as a form of self-defense that individuals can take upon them to defend themselves and the wider society. That's one opinion. That's Emma Goldman's sort of opinions. Now, I really don't think that you will get the figure of the anarchist that goes to bomb either figureheads or kill capitalists nowadays. I think that kind of era is probably, I guess, from the left anarchist tradition. Rather, it's not with us. Of course, we do have anarchists that go to anti-G8 demonstrations and they deface banks, and they kind of get involved in property related violence. We have that, and some writers, anarchist thinkers such as Ruth Keener, suggest that we should see them as resisting capitalism, but also critiquing it, revealing to us that these buildings that they're attacking that are sustain certain hierarchies in a society are based on no foundation. So they're doing that. She says, oh, that's kind of that's one way of seeing them, as a critique of the conditions that we are living. That's I'm kind of more I was thinking about it when I was you prompted me to read a little bit more about Berkman and read some of his essays, and I was reading a really lovely essay on why are we lazy. All right, and in that kind of essay, he says that people are lazy because they're not doing the jobs that they are inspired to do, and they're remunerated very badly. And he uses this example that is almost diachronic. He uses the example of the cleaner and the doctor, right, or the medical physician. He says those two people are doing the same job. The one is trying to clean spaces so we can have good public health and sanitation, and the other is trying to treat us when we get ill. So they're both in the realm of public health, but they're both remunerated so differently. And for him, this kind of differential remuneration is a result of some invisible violence, all right, that happens in our society. So we can see this question, we can see anarchism, and I'm not talking about the forms of violence. We can see that once we protest, through protest rather than anything else, when we're protesting against, for example, for equal pay for cleaners, and there's been big campaigns in university for cleaners to be paid equally and have good healthcare. When we're doing that, we are, I think, creating the conditions for a better. They're not violent acts, even if they do not have legal backing. They're not violent acts to protect such conditions. And what they're doing, they're creating, I think, they're removing an obstacle, all right, this invisible violence, to enable these workers to have a better life conditions. So I think violence is not necessarily this physical violence, but I understand violence as something that obstructs individuals to grow and flourish and live up to their potentials.
We're going to be talking a lot more about Goldman and Berkman's views on violence, including the essay that Lucy D referred to called The Psychology of Political Violence that Goldman published in a book in 1910. At the moment, though, I want to look at a different essay in that book, which was published when Goldman was 41, called Anarchism, What It Really Stands For. I thought it would be interesting here to insert a little bit of a preview of an adult Goldman's perspective on anarchism and what it basically means. This is what she writes.
Anarchism is the great liberator of man from the phantoms that have held him captive. It is the arbiter and pacifier of the two forces for individual and social harmony. To accomplish that unity, anarchism has declared war on the pernicious influences which have so far prevented the harmonious blending of individual and social instincts, the individual and society. Religion, the dominion of the human mind. Property, the dominion of human needs. And government, the dominion of human conduct, represent the stronghold of man's enslavement and all the horrors it entails.
She goes on to further explain.
Anarchism stands for a social order based on the free grouping of individuals for the purpose of producing real social wealth. An order that will guarantee to every human being free access to the earth and full enjoyment of the necessities of life, according to individual desires, tastes, and inclinations. This is not a wild fantasy or an aberration of the mind. It is the conclusion arrived at by hosts of intellectual men and women the world over, a conclusion resulting from the close and studious observation of the tendencies of modern society, individual liberty and economic equality, the twin forces for the birth of what is fine and true in man.
We'll get back to Goldman in just a minute, but before leaving this sort of generalized overview of anarchism, I wanted to hear Professor Bennett's perspective after having studied Living My Life in such detail, what he thought about it, including whether anarchism is misunderstood as lawlessness or just random chaos.
Yeah, definitely. And certainly when I first came to Goldman, however long ago, I myself was under a kind of false impression of what anarchism is and its history, right? I knew little of Goldman, let alone the scores of other figures around her, let alone the others, be it Kropotkin, Bakunin, Proudhon, Malatesta, all of these figures who, if anything else, are united in their disagreement with one another, sometimes to the point of vitriol, but who nonetheless are thinking of society and the individual, not, as you put it, as random chaos, but the product of conscientious living together and principle and the seeking of, even if utopian, alternative futures that are genuinely just. There is a lot that I disagree with and that I find frustrating in those arguments, but it is a shockingly unknown and under-discussed area of intellectual thought. The tragic thing too is that in some ways we within the United States are inheritors of the work done in the late 19th and early 20th century by state actors to discredit anarchists and radicals as alien, as non-native.
In that last point, he shares Dr. Lucy's sentiment that anarchists have purposely been maligned in order to limit their power to bring about change. I told him I thought that one thing that this idea of anarchists being lawless kind of concealed is their underlying optimism, their faith in humanity. This is what he thought.
So an area where these conversations do happen a lot are developing what have been kind of off the beaten path conversations, but are becoming a little more mainstream around, the abolition of prisons, defund the police, all of these conversations that had been kind of just in, universities and small circles and on the streets, but have kind of been pushed into, some mainstream discussion. And there too, however you feel about those arguments broadly understood, there's often a kind of resilience and reluctance to think of what human behavior and society could be without the structures that we're used to. And going all the way back to Goldman and Berkman, that is one of the things, again, that I am indebted to them, is an encouragement to think in the realm of possibility and open futures, not to be starry-eyed and naive, right? In one of Goldman's greatest essays, she takes on this charge that anarchism is a beautiful ideal, as though that's an insult. And that becomes for her kind of a rallying cry. What worse thing could there be, or what better thing could there be than a beautiful ideal? What, if anything else, has this country been formed around than a set of beautiful ideals not yet realized? And for Goldman, that requires a humility, that requires imagination, that requires flexibility in trying to think about what, even something like the procurement of goods and their distribution could look like without a market or without a prison. And I find that inspiring, even if you then ultimately disagree with where those arguments go. Just that impulse is great.
But where we last left off with the younger Goldman, she was sitting in that beer hall in Rochester, hearing about anarchism for the first time in her life. It set her off on a journey to learn every single thing she could about it. At the same time, she was still dating her coworker Jacob Kershner, and the two of them lived in the house above the store with her parents, with Helena, and with their younger brothers. She was just really not feeling this relationship at all, except for the fact that Kershner was cute.
His interest in books, which had first attracted me to him, had waned. He had fallen into the ways of his shopmates, playing cards and attending dull dances. I, on the contrary, was filled with striving and aspirations. In spirit I was still in Russia, in my beloved St. Petersburg, living in the world of books I had read, the operas I had heard, the circle of students I had known. I hated Rochester, even more than before. But Kershner was the only human being I had met since my arrival. He filled a void in my life, and I was strongly attracted to him.
All the same, after a few months of dating, they wound up getting married. And then, to make things even more difficult, it turned out on their wedding night that he had erectile dysfunction. So this marriage was already not going swimmingly from the outset. But then about 6 months later, something happened that haunted her forever. 4 of the innocent men convicted of the Haymarket bombing were hung. And it actually would have been 5, except for one of them, a guy named Louis Ling, had smuggled a dynamite detonator into his cell and bit down on it the night before, killing himself. The night Goldman heard the news from Chicago, her parents had friends over, but she was so angry she couldn't contain herself.
Everybody talked about the Chicago events. I was entirely absorbed in what I felt as my own loss. And then I heard the coarse laugh of a woman. In a shrill voice, she sneered, "What's all this lament about? The men were murderers. It is well they were hanged." With one leap, I was at the woman's throat. And then I felt myself torn back. Someone said, "The child has gone crazy." I wrenched myself free, grabbed a pitcher of water from the table, and threw it with all my force into the woman's face. "Out, out," I cried, "or I will kill you!" The terrified woman made for the door, and I dropped to the ground in a fit of crying.
After that, Goldman was essentially done with her life in Rochester. She officially divorced Kershner and went to live in New Haven, where she made a whole bunch of Russian anarchist friends. For some reason that I don't really get, she only stayed in New Haven for a little while and then went back to her family in Rochester where she lived with Helena. Once she got there, Kershner threatened to poison himself unless she married him again.
Kershner's threat frightened me. I could not be responsible for his death. I remarried him. My parents rejoiced, and so did Lena and her husband, but Helena was sick with grief. Without Kershner's knowledge, I took up a course in dressmaking in order to have a trade that would free me from the shop. During 3 long months, I wrestled with my husband to let me go my way. I tried to make him see the futility of living a patched life, but he remained obdurate. Late one night, after bitter recriminations, I left Jacob Kershner and my home. This time, definitely.
As far as I know, that was the last time she ever saw Jacob Kershner, although he would become important again in her life many years later. She left Kershner and her family in Rochester and headed down to New York City on the train. One of the very few things that she brought with her was a piece of paper with the address of a particularly dark and violent anarchist newspaper called the Freiheit. More on that next time. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe and to tell your friends. Check out acrossfromjericho.com for all sorts of good stuff like pictures, transcripts, show notes, and links to all of our socials. Across from Jericho is a Split River Media production, researched and narrated by me, Jeff Grossman. This episode starred Sarah Natochenny as Emma Goldman. Audio mixing and sound design by Scott Rosenthal. Logo and graphics by Mark Richard Smith. The website was designed by Alec Farrell, and the theme music is Yo Cool by Alexander Nakarada. Special thanks to Brad Jarman, Teresa Buchheister, the Emma Goldman Papers Public History Project, Karen J. Greenberg, and Ethan Nichtern. Dedicated to the memory of my dad, Richard Grossman. Copyright 2023 by Split River Media, LLC.